Good afternoon, I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holochak, and today I'm going to bring together two passions of mine, my study of Ukraine and, of course, my work on Thomas Jefferson. And I'm going to read to you a short essay that I have recently written on Ukrainians and their love of liberty. The title is, at least provisionally, Why Ukrainians Are Fighting So Valiantly Against the Russians, a Jeffersonian Lesson for Complacent Americans. The brutal war between Ukraine and Russia, incited by Russian forces on February 24 of this year, 2022, what Russia euphemistically calls its special military operation, with the twin aims of denazification, in other words, a change of the Ukrainian regime, and demilitarization, in other words, loss of Ukrainian sovereignty, has not thus far been going according to Vladimir Putin's plan, which, according to U.S. intelligence sources, was to seize rapidly Kiev and supplant President Volodymyr Zelensky with a pro-Russian puppet. Ukrainians, under their Jewish president among them, were expected to throw down their arms when confronted by the vaunted Russian military machine and allow Russian soldiers to take control of Ukraine with few Russian casualties. Yet Ukrainian resistance, led by a president who willingly aims to lay down his life in the service of his country, has been stout. Ukraine has of this writing successfully conducted counteroffensives to Russian assaults, and the war today continues to end with no end in sight. Continues to be fought with no end in sight. Though thousands of Ukrainian soldiers as well as innocents have been killed, their bravery and resolve go unquestioned. Now, Ukraine is performing amazingly well against an adversary that is prodigiously much more equipped. Why? One reason is that Ukraine has had and continues to have the invaluable monetary, military, and humanitarian aid of NATO countries, which are rightly concerned that success in seizing Ukraine might lead to enticement for Putin to expand his initial aim and look next, for instance, to Poland, to Hungary, to Romania, to Lithuania. That today seems unlikely, however, due to the strain of the war on Russia's economy and Russia's limited military resources that are being seen today as the war drags on. Another reason is that Ukrainians are fighting for what Thomas Jefferson in his Declaration of Independence called life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. While the millions of the infirm, the elderly, women, and children have fled the borders of Ukraine, and while men between the ages of 16 and 60 must remain and fight under Ukrainian martial law, many soldiers fight from choice, not coercion, and many non-combatants remain in Ukraine because Ukraine is their country, because Ukraine's their home, because there's nowhere else to go, or because nowhere else they wish to go. They're fighting for a life that is of their own making. They're fighting for freedom. Now, freedom or liberty is acknowledged to be a protean, a slippery concept. It's readily cognized as it readily admits of a definition, but nearly impossible to put into practice, and when it is in practice, if only approximately, it, like human goodness or health, tends to go unnoticed. Yet when it's missing, its absence is painfully, regretfully felt. There has been in his day, and perhaps in human history, no greater ambassador for liberty than the great Thomas Jefferson. In a late-in-life communication to Isaac Tiffany, April 4, 1819, he defines liberty thus: "Of liberty, then, I would say that, in the whole plenitude of its extent, it is unobstructed action according to our will." Jefferson then refines his definition to accommodate the notion that humans are social creatures. He adds, "But rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. I do not add within the limits of law, because law is often the tyrant's will and is always so when it violates the right of an individual." So we have from Jefferson what might be called agentive or individual liberty, liberty in abstracto, and political or social liberty, liberty in usus. By agentive liberty, we can understand will-sanctioned action that is unobstructed. By political or social liberty, we can understand will-sanctioned action that is unobstructed and mindful of the right of others to act similarly. Now, I'm not claiming that Jefferson is original here. His definitions are certainly consistent with numerous others of his day, such as John Toland, John Adams, and Algernon Sidney. Sidney writes, liberty solely consists in any independency upon the will of another, and by the name of slave we understand the man who can neither dispose of his person or goods, but enjoys all at the will of his master. And so for Sidney, liberty consists in action, in that action which is unobstructed, and it is given the sanction of the will. And he adds political liberty has the consideration as a moral consideration, other regard. And so where there is obstruction, there can be no liberty, and where an action is executed without the sanction of will, there can be no liberty. So we need to have unobstruction, and we need to have will-sanctioned activity. Now, Jefferson's political writings and numerous letters are fraught with reference to both forms of liberty or freedom. His 1774 Summary Review of the Rights of British America, in that work he mentions the freedom of language and sentiment which becomes a free people claiming their rights as derived from the laws of nature. He sums, the God who gave us liberty, the God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. The hand of force may destroy, but it cannot disjoin them. 2 years later, in his Declaration, Jefferson writes of the equality of all men and that their Creator gave them the three inalienable rights. As you all know, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. He said that governments deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed are constituted by men to preserve those rights. He adds, when they fail to do so, the people are by natural right entitled to alter or abolish their government and institute a new government so structured as to affect their happiness and safety. Now, while the inalienable rights are unconditioned, the right to revolution is conditioned, as it applies only when a government is consistently coercive. When it's consistently coercive, we have the right to revolution. It's a conditioned right, not an unconditional right. Now, Jefferson's addresses as president abound with references to liberty. I proffer a couple of illustrations. In his first inaugural address, he begins with a vivid depiction of Americans enjoying the rich productions of their industry. He writes that the greatness of America lies in the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. I wish we would underscore that today. Reason combating error and freedom of opinion. We have a freedom to say what we want, but that what we say ought to be able to be subject to the scrutiny of reason. Okay. In his first annual message, he proposes laissez-faire economics. He writes, agriculture, manufactures, commerce, and navigation, the four pillars of our prosperity, are the most thriving when left most free to individual enterprise. So too do Jefferson's letters tell us of his notion of liberty. Of them, the most scandalous are those written concerning Shays' rebellion, which occurred while Jefferson was in Paris as minister plenipotentiary to France. Now, Jefferson argues vigorously for the benefits of periodic rebellions, I should say. To Edward Carrington in January of 1787, he says that turbulence through rebellion prevents the degeneracy of government and nourishes a general attention to public affairs. Later in the same month, he writes to Madison of the same year. He adds, I hold that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing and as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical. It is a medicine necessary for the sound health of government. Later in the year, on November 13th, he says, in a letter to William Stephen Smith, God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. He's talking about shaves. Public quiet in the face of a perceived threat to liberty, writes Jefferson, is a lethargy, the forerunner of death to the public liberty. Jefferson sums, and this is a famous quote you've all heard, which I put up on my Facebook page not long ago. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It's its natural manure. To William Short, years later, 1793, Jefferson thus laments the gross loss of life in the French Revolution. He writes, "My own affections have been deeply wounded by some of the martyrs to this cause, but rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and Eve left in every country and left free, it would be better than it is now." Now, such passages have been construed to be sort of outrageous, to be excessive, and convinced many scholars. I cite Connor Cruz O'Brien in his book called The Long Affair, Thomas Jefferson, the French Revolution, have convinced these scholars that Jefferson was an extreme liberal for whom the prize of liberty was so great that any means of attainment, however sanguinary, was warrantable. That verdict, so to speak, is not warranted. Jefferson, in a telling letter to son-in-law John Wales Epps on November 6, 1813, calls the Revolutionary War, and I really like this term, calls it a holy war. He says, if ever there was a holy war, it was that which saved our liberties and gave us independence. Now here he's not being sacrilegious. The liberty for Jefferson is of the essence of man. He writes, the God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. Again, the hand of force may destroy but cannot disjoin them. Again, that's taken from a summary view of 1774. Now, Jefferson was neither naive nor was he bloodthirsty. However, Connor Cruz O'Brien, he never viewed liberty autotelically, in other words, as something to be valued for its own sake. Though he says to Thaddeus Kosciuszko in 1810 that the freedom and happiness of man are the main objects of all science, those main objects are not independent objects. Liberty for Jefferson was never an end, but a means, the most vital means to human happiness. There can be no happiness without liberty, though there can be liberty without happiness. For Jefferson, conceiving happiness without liberty is bedlam, not Elysium. This takes us back to Plato's Republic and Plato on democracy. Without being able to do what one wants to do, agentive liberty, without knowing what sorts of things are worth wanting, is angst engendering, not calming or liberating. Being able to do what one wants to do without allowing others the same right, in other words, without political liberty, is tyranny. Because humans, following Aristotle, are social beings, agentive liberty is answerable to political liberty. In other words, the liberty for me to do as I want to do is answerable to the constraint that I must allow others to do as they want to do. In other words, I can't harm others, as John Stuart Mill famously says. Now, Ukrainians are fighting so valiantly for their cause because they know that having property that is one's own in a country that is one's own, and that living as one chooses to live, are things without which life can be lived, but not lived as one's own. In other words, it's a life of contentment, not a life of happiness. The Greeks had a notion for that they called oikeiosis, which meant the impulse of an animal toward things by nature belonging to it. Humans are born, says the philosopher, the Greek Stoic philosopher Hierocles, with a natural inclination toward self-preservation, the most primitive bond of any living thing, and then inclined to bond over time with those nearest to them, their parents and siblings, with others close to them, other relatives and friends, with those in their village, those in their state, those in other nations, and finally, with all human beings. Jefferson, a large lover and avid reader of the works of ancient Athenians, the Stoics too, and one who read ancient historical works chiefly for their moral lessons, agreed, though he added the attainment and enjoyment of all mankind of as much liberty as each may exercise without injury to the equal liberty of his fellow citizens, and that's to the Comte de Musnier in 1795. Citizens of free nations are easily diverted from enjoyment of their right to freedom. And Jefferson knew that, and he wisely cautions in a pessimistic note at the end of query 17 of his notes on the state of Virginia, that when absorbed in money-making, free people become acquisitive and forget about freedom. It is, as I mentioned above, a foible that humans tend not to enjoy the things most precious until they are lost. That is certainly the case with liberty. Now, whether or not we cognize it, the 20th century world, in spite of, I should say the 21st century world, in spite of alarming examples of countries like North Korea, China, Belarus, and Russia, is inescapably wedded to liberty. Russia's vociferous, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine is for free nations, a wake-up call, a signal that Jefferson's tree of liberty is wilting. The blood of tyrants must be spilt, and in the process, so too, must be spilt the blood of patriots. The unexampled unanimity of support by nations of NATO and most other nations around the world is because those nations recognize that liberty, each person's and each nation's right to self-determination, is worth spilt blood. That is why Jefferson wrote to William Green Munford in 1788, to preserve the freedom of the human mind and the freedom of the press, every spirit should be ready to devote itself to martyrdom. So for as long as we may think as we will and speak as we think, the condition of man will proceed to improvement. When liberty is absent, as it is in Russia, people can live relatively contentedly and securely, but as I've said before, not happily. And happiness is the aim, as the ancients said, of all human activity. All eyes, writes Jefferson in his last known letter to Roger Waitman on June 24, 1826, and remember Jefferson dies on July 4, 1826, are opened or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. These are grounds of hope for others. Ukrainians are fighting with ferocity for the rights not to be saddled and spurred by others. It is for them, as it is for all liberty-loving nations, a holy war, as it cannot be for those sanguinary interlopers who aim to take what is by right and by nature not theirs to take. If Jefferson is correct to note that liberty consists essentially of activity, and if the defining features of any democracy, government by the people, is embrace of liberty, then Ukraine has brilliantly shown as much as, if not more than, any other country in the world today that it is a tried and true democracy. Slava Ukraini. I hope you enjoyed this video. I enjoyed presenting it to you. And let us hope for peace soon and a free Ukraine and recognition by Russia with the advent of a new leader. Hopefully that the war ends and Russia takes a democratic turn in the course of events. As I said, I hope you enjoyed the video, and good day for now. Thank you.